Welcome to Pacific States University's online lecture series for Gen 108, Explorations in the Arts. Today, we are diving into the Impressionist Revolution. You know, this isn't just another art movement. It's a profound shift in how we actually see the world, quite literally. We're going to be exploring a super dynamic period, roughly 1860 to 1890, a time when a really radical group of young painters just completely tore up the rulebook and rewrote the rules of art.
To really get why this revolution had to happen, we've got to look at the massive gap between the established art world and, well, reality. Picture this. You're walking into the Salon, the most prestigious art exhibition in Paris, and it's the year 1865. The state-run Académie des Beaux-Arts essentially demanded that art function like a pristine, flawless mirror. They wanted invisible brushstrokes, the subjects, grand historical battles, mythological gods, perfectly packaged and completely static. But step outside into the streets of 1860s Paris, and it's a totally different story. The Industrial Revolution is booming. Steam trains are tearing through the countryside, and early photography is capturing the world exactly as it is. Life just wasn't standing still for a polished portrait anymore. It was fast-paced, industrial, and constantly in motion. These young artists were staring at those massive, glossy academic canvases and thinking, this doesn't look like real life, and it definitely doesn't reflect how our eyes actually perceive the world around us.
So, here's our visual syllabus for today's lecture. First, we'll quickly touch on the rigid academic tradition. Second, we'll look at the ancestors of the blur. Third, we'll break down the three pillars of Impressionism. And finally, the birth of the label itself.
Let's jump right in. Section 2, Ancestors of the Blur, focusing on J.M.W. Turner and Edouard Manet.
Revolutions rarely just happen overnight, right? Before we can really analyze the core Impressionists, we have to look at the artistic rebels who paved the way. So let's cross the English Channel and look at the British master J.M.W. Turner. Decades before the word Impressionism was even a thought, Turner was out there experimenting radically with the atmospheric effects of light and weather. Photo: J.M.W. Turner's painting Rain, Steam, and Speed, the Great Western Railway, showing a swirling vortex of rain, fog, and a steam train. Take a really deliberate look at this magnificent piece from 1844. Notice how the steam train is almost entirely swallowed up by mist, smoke, and this driving rain? Turner didn't care about painting the hard iron bolts of the engine. He wanted to capture the sheer sensation of speed, the heavy, palpable texture of the air itself. And when young French painters visited London and saw this, wow, it was an absolute revelation. They realized, hey, light and atmosphere can actually be the main subjects of a painting, not just the background.
Armed with this profound realization about atmosphere, these young artists headed back to Paris. And there, they found their ultimate ideological leader, Edouard Manet. Now, Manet is frequently called the father of modernism, and for good reason. Even though he never officially exhibited with the Impressionist collective, his rebellious realism gave them the guts to break the established rules. Manet firmly refused to paint those idealized mythological fantasies the Academy loved. Instead, he chose the gritty, raw, and sometimes uncomfortable reality of modern Parisian life.
Nothing illustrates Manet's rebellion quite like his 1863 masterpiece. When this was exhibited, it caused an absolute scandal. I mean, an uproar. Yes, the subject matter, a contemporary nude sitting casually with fully clothed men in a park, was incredibly shocking to the public. But the real scandal for the art world, it was how he painted it. Notice that flat, harsh lighting? It almost looks like a modern camera flash. It totally ignores that soft, gradual shading the Academy demanded. The background perspective is intentionally just a bit off, and the brushwork is deliberately rough and visible. Manet was forcefully reminding everyone looking at it, hey, you are not looking through a magical window into antiquity. You are looking at raw paint smeared onto a flat canvas.
Which brings us to Section 3, the three pillars of Impressionism. Inspired by Turner's atmospheric breakthroughs and Manet's incredibly rebellious realism, a tight-knit collective started to form. We're talking about brilliant minds here: Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Edgar Degas, and Camille Pissarro. They all united under three absolutely crucial pillars: an obsession with light, the use of pure, unblended color, and loose, rapid brushwork. Let's break each of these down. The first pillar, their absolute obsession with light, was actually made possible by a technological breakthrough. For centuries, artists had to mix their paints in dark, candlelit studios, storing pigments in, get this, messy pig bladders. Yuck, right? But in the 19th century, the collapsible metal paint tube was invented. This one simple tool was a total game changer. It allowed artists to pack up their supplies, walk outside, and paint right in the open air. This practice is known as en plein air. But, as you can imagine, once you leave that perfectly controlled studio environment and paint outside, you hit a terrifying reality. Natural light changes every single second. As the sun moves, shadows stretch, colors completely transform. It's wild. Claude Monet understood this shifting reality better than anyone else. He realized that an object doesn't just have one fixed permanent color. Take a close look at these examples. A haystack isn't merely yellow. At sunrise, it might reflect vibrant pink and orange. At high noon, it's this brilliant, blinding gold. And at twilight, it dissolves into deep, moody purple. To capture this, Monet's process became incredibly frantic. He would literally set up multiple canvases in a field and switch from one to the next every 20 minutes as the sun moved, just desperately chasing that fleeting light.
To capture that brilliant, constantly shifting sunlight, the Impressionists had to invent their second pillar, a totally new approach to color. The traditional academic artists mixed their colors heavily on a palette to create dark, muddy, realistic shadows. But the Impressionists, because they were observing nature so closely, realized that shadows outdoors are rarely just black or gray. They're actually filled with reflected ambient colors, blues, purples, violets. So they used a technique called optical mixing. Instead of blending blue and yellow paint together on the palette to make a flat green, they'd place a stroke of pure, unblended blue right next to a stroke of pure yellow directly on the canvas. Up close, it looks like a chaotic mosaic, but step back and your eye naturally blends them together, creating this vibrant, luminous color that literally seems to vibrate with actual light.
And that naturally brings us to the third pillar. If your goal is to capture a specific 20-minute reflection of a sunset on the water before it disappears forever, well, you simply don't have the time to be neat. You have to paint at light speed. This absolute necessity for speed resulted in their trademark loose, rapid brushwork. They used short, thick, unblended strokes, just slashing across the canvas. They weren't trying to paint the individual static leaves on a tree, no way. They were trying to paint the flicker of green and yellow light, dancing as the wind violently hit the branches. The brushstroke itself actually became a record of the artist's immediate physical experience in that exact split second.
Moving on to Section 4, The Birth of a Label, the 1874 exhibition.
Fed up with being constantly shut out of the establishment, this collective made a super dramatic decision. They were going to host their own independent exhibition. Let's quickly review the chronological journey that got us here. We started with Turner's atmospheric breakthroughs in 1844. Then we moved to Monet's shocking flat realism in 1863. Next, Monet begins capturing the fleeting dawn in 1872. And all of this momentum finally culminates in April of 1874, when this group, calling themselves the Anonymous Society of Painters, Sculptors, and Printmakers, opened the doors to their very first independent exhibition, held at the former studio of the photographer Nadar.
Now, enter an art critic named Louis Leroy. Leroy walked into this independent exhibition and was, frankly, absolutely horrified by what he saw. To his classically trained eye, these works weren't finished paintings at all. They just looked like messy, incompetent sketches. He stopped dead in front of this specific painting by Claude Monet, titled Impression Sunrise. Leroy went back to his desk and penned a fiercely sarcastic, scathing review for the satirical newspaper Le Charivari. Mocking the title of Monet's painting, Leroy went with heavy, pompous disdain, "Impression, I was certain of it. I was just telling myself that, since I was impressed, there had to be some impression in it. And what freedom, what ease of workmanship. Wallpaper in its embryonic state is more finished than that seascape. Ouch."
So Louis Leroy fully intended the word impressionist to be a career-ending insult. He was publicly calling them lazy, unfinished amateurs who were just slapping raw paint onto a canvas. But here is the magnificent historical irony of it all. The artists absolutely loved it. They embraced the insult, stole the word right out from under Leroy's pen, and proudly began calling themselves the Impressionists. They completely leaned into the whole concept. They basically argued that Leroy was actually right. They weren't painting a precise photographic, geographical inventory of a harbor. They were painting their deeply personal optical impression of a single, unrepeatable moment in time. By the time this movement began to wind down around 1890, these artists had completely shattered 400 years of Western artistic tradition. Think about it. Since the Renaissance, the ideal was always that a canvas should be a perfect photographic window to the world, a fixed, objective reality. But the Impressionist reality proved that human experience is entirely subjective. What you see depends entirely on who is looking, where the sun happens to be standing in the sky, and how the atmosphere feels at that exact fleeting microsecond.
By freeing the paintbrush from the rigid duty of strict mechanical copying, the Impressionists opened the floodgates for literally all the radical, experimental modern art movements of the 20th century. As we conclude today's lecture, I want you all to consider a final question. How does capturing a single, unrepeatable moment change the way we experience the modern world? Really think about how that mindset shifts our understanding of reality itself. Next time you look at a painting and notice the heavy textured impasto of the paint or those vibrant, unblended streaks of light, remember that you are looking through a lens crafted by 19th century rebels who dared to paint the world exactly as they experienced it. Thank you so much for joining me for this session. Please leave your thoughts and questions about Monet's color theories or Manet's rebellious subjects in the class comments, and I look forward to seeing you all in our next lecture.